From the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kohatkar. It's Thursday, January 15th, 2015. We'll examine the latest on GOP legislative efforts in Congress today on immigration and abortion, and survey the increasingly crowded field of Republican presidential candidates with my guest, John Nichols. And we'll refocus attention onto the Ebola crisis in West Africa. As optimistic pronouncements are made on eradicating the deadly disease, there's both good news and bad news, and we'll speak with Dr. Duogbeh Chris Nyan. Plus, Todd Wolfson joins us to discuss his new book, Digital Rebellion, The Birth of the Cyber Left. That's coming up after the news. Joining us to analyze today's headlines is Chenjerai Kumanyika. He's an assistant professor of communication studies at Clemson University. Hi, Chenjerai.
Hi, how are you doing?
Doing very well. Thanks for joining us. A 20-year-old white man operating under a Muslim name has been arrested by the FBI for conspiring to attack the U.S. Capitol. Christopher Lee Cornell was arrested yesterday in Cincinnati, Ohio, for allegedly planning an attack similar to the Charlie Hebdo attacks in Paris. Meanwhile, one of the original French founders of Charlie Hebdo, 80-year-old Henri Roussel, told press that Stéphane Charbonnier, the murdered editor of the magazine, overdid the insulting caricatures of the Prophet Muhammad, asking, quote, what made him feel the need to drag the team into overdoing it. He called the magazine staff, quote, fools who took an unnecessary risk. Pope Francis has also jumped into the debate, saying during his visit to the Philippines that although murdering in the name of religion is, quote, an absurdity, he also said, quote, one cannot provoke, one cannot insult other people's faith, one cannot make fun of faith. It was just over a week ago that 3 armed gunmen killed 10 of the magazine's staffers before being involved in bloody standoffs involving hostages. Well, Chenjerai, do you think we're seeing a more nuanced public debate of the Charlie Hebdo affair a week later?
Sonali, I think we are, but it's more so internationally than what we're seeing domestically. The Pope's comments were certainly encouraging in the sense that they didn't reproduce the flagrant Islamophobia that is so prevalent right now. But in the case of the U.S., we do see them acknowledging a white man as a terrorist, which is rare in the U.S. But I think it's mainly because it fits within the larger narrative related to ISIS and, the Middle East. So I think that we are seeing some, Roussel's comments were poorly timed, to say the least, and worrisome in the way that I think that they blame the staff for these tragic events. So I think we are seeing some nuance and people making some more risky comments.
And then here in the United States, the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy has released its 5th annual report on tax rates and has found that poor and middle-class Americans are paying twice the rate of state and local taxes, 10.9%, as wealthy Americans who pay only 5.4%. The shocking disparity is the result of regressive tax structures such as sales and excise taxes. The group's executive director, Matt Gardner, said, quote, upside-down state tax systems didn't cause the growing income divide, but they certainly exacerbate the problem. The study didn't include federal taxes. Meanwhile, offering a plan for some measure of relief to working families, President Obama is expected today to unveil to Congress the Healthy Families Act, which would grant Americans 7 days of paid sick leave a year. The president will also cement a policy today to give federal workers 6 weeks of paid parental leave after the birth of a child. Well, Chenjerai, does it strike you in the clearest sense upon reading these stories how far behind the U.S. is on economic justice compared to most of the industrialized world?
Yes, it is striking when we get this news. Of course, this news is not new. In October, UNICEF released a similar report, and they looked at the effects of this on children. So different groups are affected different ways. These types of statistics are racialized as well. Meanwhile, in state, legislatures, what we have is, sort of regressive and weird tax structures. In Seattle, we just had the Republican Senate vote to make it harder to produce tax reform. So, but where I think there's a sense of encouragement is we've also seen unprecedented protests against poverty, various forms that poverty takes with fast food workers, workers at Walmart, and just signs that people are willing to get forth and exercise their democratic rights.
And finally, the Academy Award nominations were announced this morning in Los Angeles. And as in previous years, the nominations are dominated by white actors and filmmakers. Wes Anderson's The Grand Budapest Hotel garnered a total of 9 major nominations, while Clint Eastwood's American Sniper was nominated for 6. The biggest snub went, predictably, to Ava DuVernay's Selma, a moving and highly acclaimed film about the historic civil rights march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama in 1965, led by Martin Luther King Jr. Neither DuVernay nor the actor who played King, David Oyelowo, were nominated for Best Director or Best Actor. Selma has come under some criticism for its portrayal of President Lyndon B. Johnson. DuVernay responded saying, quote, "I wasn't interested in making a white savior movie." Well, Chenjerai, are the Oscars even relevant anymore?
Well, people tune into the Oscars, but the problem is the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, the membership is over 60% older white men. And when you look at the process that they vote, it's very, it's not a very democratic process at all. So I think the relevance is questionable, but the advertising industry and the entertainment industry puts tremendous amount of money into these films, and then they try to sort of encourage us to pay attention to the films that they've invested in. I find it striking and disturbing that these actors weren't nominated in Selma. I thought this was a tremendous performance in Selma that deserved the nomination, but again, look at the governing body and look at the governance structure.
Well, Chenjerai, always a pleasure to have you on. We'll talk to you again next week. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And by the way, we will have a debate scheduled between the writer of the book that American Sniper was based on, Jim DeFelice, and media critic Rania Khalek next Tuesday. So do tune in to the show then. Chenjerai Kumanyika is our Newsflash guest expert. He is an assistant professor of communications at Clemson University. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. You can now watch Uprising on Free Speech TV, which airs on Dish Network Channel 9415, DirecTV Channel 348, and hundreds of part-time cable affiliates, as well as on Roku. The GOP-dominated House of Representatives yesterday passed a bill that would block the funding of President Obama's executive action on immigration, easing deportation requirements for a number of undocumented people. The bill funds the Department of Homeland Security while leaving out monies for the immigration policy. DHS's funding ends on February 27th, and a major battle over it is likely to ensue as President Obama has threatened to veto the bill. The House has also introduced a federal abortion ban for all pregnancies of more than 20 weeks along. Meanwhile, setting its sight on the White House, there is still no clear GOP candidate for the presidential nomination, although the field of personalities keeps growing. Former presidential candidate Mitt Romney has strongly hinted that he would aim for the nomination despite losing to President Obama in 2012. G.W. Bush's brother, Jeb, former Florida governor, is so serious about being the nominee that he recently resigned from the boards of a number of corporations. New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, who has already begun hiring campaign staff, and Florida Senator Marco Rubio are also candidates in what is being seen as a very crowded field. Among Democrats, many seem to have assumed Hillary Clinton will be the main candidate. And in California, Senator Barbara Boxer announced her intention to retire, setting off excitement over her coveted seat. Attorney General Kamala Harris appears to be a likely candidate. My guest is John Nichols. He's a contributing writer for The Progressive and In These Times, an associate editor for the Capital Times in Madison, Wisconsin. He's written a number of books, including my favorite, not least because of its title, Uprising, How Wisconsin Renewed the Politics of Protest from Madison to Wall Street. Hi, John.
Hello, Sonali. I hope we can see each other well.
Yes. Now, on immigration, the GOP laid the groundwork for this DHS funding bill last year when they funded the government, leaving out funding for the Department of Homeland Security. They're capitalizing on this groundwork that they laid last year. It's an impressive strategy, but could it work? Could they actually undo Obama's executive action?
It's possible, but all of this is going to be wrestled with in the courts. And remember, it's the Republicans who've said they want to take these issues to court. They've hired some top lawyers. They're spending our tax dollars to do that. And so there's going to be a huge wrestling on these issues. Remember, the president has a significant amount of authority to issue executive orders. And he has done that in the past. And I think the important thing for people to understand is that in many ways, this is a national debate. And the debate goes beyond what Congress does with one spending bill or what the president does. It really involves kind of putting these issues out front and saying, what do you want to see happen? The Republicans are going to try every stunt they can to undermine what the president has done. The president needs to push back. He needs to aggressively explain what he's doing and why. You can't just let this fade away into the courts and let it remain, kind of in limbo for a long period of time. And the one key thing I would remind people of is that the way to see this intervention by the president is not merely as an immigration statement, not merely as an initiative as regards immigration. While that is highly important, and while past presidents have used executive orders on immigration, it's important to understand that there are times in history when presidents must step up to do what Congress will not do, when issues are not addressed, especially when those issues involve historically marginalized or underprivileged, underpowered peoples. And if we look back historically, we see Franklin Roosevelt, at the behest of civil rights campaigners in 1941, integrated the defense industries. Harry Truman integrated the military in 1948. In the 1950s and 1960s, Presidents Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson made major initiatives as regards integrating the public workforces and affirmative action in a whole host of ways. And all of this was done with executive orders.
Right.
Sometimes we have to understand that's the way it's done.
So let's talk about the abortion ban. This was one that had been introduced in the past. Now, of course, the GOP controls in terms of having a majority, both the House and the Senate. How serious is this ban? Obama says he'll veto it, but he faces opposition in the Senate, which is new. Is this essentially a strategy to get the Supreme Court to overturn Roe v. Wade? Again, the Republicans laying the groundwork for things they'll capitalize on in the future?
Sure. I think there's no doubt that that's what we're seeing. They've been doing it in the states now for a number of years with incredibly aggressive measures. Generally, those measures have been shot down by the federal courts, the appeals courts, and even the U.S. Supreme Court. It's important to remember that we have a U.S. Supreme Court that, while much more conservative in the past, probably still has a pro-choice majority. The question's really on the margins of this debate. What kind of limits can be brought in? What kind of restrictions can be brought in? And this is an important fight. It's one that's getting a good deal of coverage, but I don't know that it's sufficient coverage. People need to understand that at the heart of the Republican Party, the issue that brings this party together is a relatively militant, at least grassroots, opposition to reproductive rights at all sorts of levels. And so for a variety of reasons, the Republicans are going to push on this. They're going to look for every in they can get. And it's going to be a real issue. The president can veto. His veto power is significant. It is exceptionally unlikely. In fact, I would say it's just not going to happen that you could get a majority to override a presidential veto. But as these fights go on a variety of fronts, you do see that exactly what you refer to, an effort to set up court battles where, again, we must understand. On the Supreme Court, we are one justice one way or the other from having a court that might take a very different position than it has historically on this issue.
And of course, the Republicans have introduced a number of bills, almost too many to keep track in their first week as the majority party in both chambers, many of which we covered last week with David Day. And let's turn to the presidential race. I was torn about whether to cover this given how early it is. And I know, of course, by the time the presidential election comes around in late 2016, our audience is probably going to be extremely tired of hearing about it. But of course, it is interesting to see how many GOP leaders are throwing their hat into the ring and what that represents for the Republican Party, which has struggled with this issue of leadership since G.W. Bush. What about Mitt Romney running? Didn't he lose so badly last time that you would think he would just give up? I mean, what does he think will be different this time round? Of course, his opponent will be different.
Well, his opponent will be different. And one of the funny things about wealth and power is that very wealthy people don't necessarily take defeat as the end of anything. And Mitt Romney is a very wealthy and very powerful man who has gotten a lot of what he's wanted in his life. And I think that what's happened here is a fascinating circumstance. He was clearly rejected by his own party in 2008. He was clearly rejected by the American people in 2012. In fact, Barack Obama had a 5 million vote margin, overwhelming landslide in the Electoral College. And notably, Barack Obama got 51% of the vote, while Mitt Romney got the ironic figure of 47%. And so when we look at this issue, we know Romney's been rejected. However, I think Romney has a passion for the presidency. There's no doubt he wants it. He's run before. And I think what happened this time was quite interesting. My sense is that Romney was holding back. He was sitting on the sidelines, looking at most of the possible Republican candidates and saying, look, I can come in late and push any of them aside. So he was looking very gracious. And then Jeb Bush came along. And Jeb Bush jumped in big. And one of the undercovered elements of Bush's initiative here is the fact that Bush's people quietly suggested, there's been some debate about the exact number, but quietly suggested about a week ago that they plan to raise $100 million in the first 3 months. Sonali, hold up. In the first 3 months.
3 months.
Of 2015. And so wow. This is what this is all about, Sonali. This is about big money, wealth, and power pushing itself into the center of our political process. Romney doesn't care what most grassroots Republicans are thinking about, doesn't certainly care what most Americans are worried about. What he does care about is, does he face competition at that highest level of wealth and power? And Bush provided that competition.
So let's talk about
Romney's moving. Yeah.
Right. Let's talk about Jeb Bush. One of the biggest accusations he faces from his fellow Republicans is that he's too liberal. He is a rhino, a Republican in name only. Is that true? And also, how much of a liability is his last name?
Okay. Two very different questions.
Yes.
Number one, is Jeb Bush a moderate? Let's forget about liberal. Is he a moderate? No. He is an extremely right-wing conservative. He's very, very conservative on social issues. He's very, very conservative on economics. He has shown a minor amount of moderation, I think somewhat based on where he comes from, Florida, a state with a lot of immigrants, on some issues of immigration and on some other issues. But that moderation should not be overestimated. It is very minor and very much within, I think, the mainstream of conservative politics, not mainstream American politics. So Bush is not a liberal, and he's not a moderate. However, he is someone who speaks more to Wall Street than to the grassroots of the Republican Party. And so he will get a tremendous pushback from people like Ted Cruz, from some conservative governors and others, who will say he is not pure enough, he is not extreme enough. And one of the interesting things is that the base of the Republican Party has never trusted the Bushes. They've always seen the Bushes as folks who, once they get power, will be a little too compassionate, a little too interested in making government function, a little too mainstream. And so there will be deep discomfort on the part of the base. But we have to be very, very careful as thinking analysts of these issues and as people who are engaged with these issues, to recognize that we should not allow our analysis to be defined by the extreme right-wing politics of the Republican Party. We should always understand that both Jeb Bush and Mitt Romney are on the right wing of the American political spectrum. They oppose positions that polling shows the overwhelming majority of Americans support. And we can't let our media kind of reposition them as moderates.
So does that also apply then to Chris Christie, New Jersey governor, and Marco Rubio, Senator? Chris Christie has already hired campaign staffers. He came under flack from his party for being a slightly less caustic to President Obama in the aftermath of Superstorm Sandy. Marco Rubio is attempting to make hay of President Obama's warming of relations with Cuba. Are either of them serious candidates?
Sure. They're potentially serious candidates, because one thing we need to understand is it is very early, and I respect your discomfort about leaping into this so early. But, we do not know for sure that Romney's going to run. He is making a lot of noise, I think, wanting to keep himself in the game. I think it's pretty clear that Bush is going to run, but there will be alternatives to both of those candidates. It is true that Bush and Romney kind of grab up a lot of that money power that might look at Christie or someone like that. But I've always felt that Christie was disqualified from serious consideration because of the scandals and the troubles he's had in New Jersey. And Rubio also has a lot of baggage. And so I'm not sure that either of them is the most likely outsider contender. I think Ted Cruz is very, very interested in this race. I think that some governors like Scott Walker from Wisconsin are making big moves. Scott Walker will be in California today in San Diego speaking to the Republican National Committee, clearly putting his name forward. And then I think it's also important to remember that there's going to be a lot of other candidates who are kind of dancing around the edges of this race, looking to get in. Some will get in. This is going to be a crowded field. And the key on this is that in a state like Iowa, where it all begins, I'm sorry, it doesn't begin in California, it doesn't begin in New York, it doesn't begin where a lot of people live, it begins in Iowa. In a state like Iowa, where you have a low turnout caucus with an immense number of people who are deeply interested in the issues we talked about at the start of this discussion, Sonali, immigration, abortion, and they are very, very right-wing on these issues. Mike Huckabee, who has started to make noise again about running, he could well win Iowa, despite all the conversations about everything else, because he is an absolute purist on the social issues.
And I mentioned Cuba and Rubio earlier. Just news coming out now as we are doing this program of the White House releasing a sweeping new set of rules to ease the embargo with Cuba and also open up travel and trade. Now, what about the Democratic nomination? Is it a done deal that Hillary Clinton is going to be the nominee? There was some noise some months ago about Bernie Sanders throwing his hat into the ring. Elizabeth Warren has said no thank you. And it's of course a liberal progressive fantasy to see somebody who maybe has the background of Barack Obama but actually carries through with a real progressive agenda to be in a position to have a real chance of being nominated and maybe even winning this thing.
Well, you know what? You know what's weird? Speaking of progressive fantasies, since November, Barack Obama has increasingly shown signals of governing as a much more progressive person. I mean,
it's quite
yesterday
remarkable.
He was talking up net neutrality. Today he's talking about paid sick leave. I mean, it's sort of like, where was this guy for most of the last 6 years? And you know what the funny thing about it is? This is why, and it's an answer to your question. The funny thing about it is that since Barack Obama has started to take a lot of progressive stands on issues that people really care about in the last couple months, his approval ratings have moved rapidly upward. It is very possible that next week, after his State of the Union address, the president will be in the positive range. You'll have more people approving than disapproving of his presidency in the polls. And so what we're getting is a signal that the American people really do respond to progressive politics, to progressive initiatives. This is important for looking at the 2016 race, because Hillary Clinton is indeed, a presumed frontrunner. But someone will get in that race as an alternative, and their viability will be determined by two things. Number one, their ability to build a grassroots movement that can counter Hillary's money. That's a great challenge. Bernie Sanders talks about that. But also their ability to be treated even minimally fairly by the media. And this is important because the media tends to define races far too much in our contemporary moment, even with the rise of social media. And so one of the reasons why a lot of progressives continue to look at Elizabeth Warren is because she seems to have some ability to crack that media barrier. My sense is that she's pretty serious about saying she doesn't want to run. People will still pressure her, at least for the next few months, to consider. If she doesn't run, I think there's no question that Bernie Sanders would like to run. And if he were to run, I think he could get some traction, especially among progressives. Jim Webb, the former senator from Virginia, might run as well and might also get some traction in some places you might not expect. Martin O'Malley, the former governor of Maryland, is talking very seriously about running, and he's actually pretty progressive on a number of issues. There's also even some talk of Deval Patrick, from the former outgoing governor of Massachusetts. So I expect Hillary Clinton will have challengers. I think it is vitally important that she faces challenges. Even if she ends up as the nominee, there is simply no question that a serious challenge to the left, or from the left, will A, show the viability of a lot of these issues, and B, force Hillary Clinton, I would hope, to get a little better on the issues. Just to remind you, if you got a race between Hillary Clinton and Jeb Bush will have been forced far to the right by his primaries. The question is, will Hillary Clinton be moved toward the much more popular progressive positions by her primaries?
Finally, the California Senate seat is now up, setting off a brief frenzy for a couple of days before Kamala Harris, our Attorney General here in the state of California, seems to have thrown her hat into the ring, and it appears as though she is quite a serious candidate. What do you make of Senator Kamala Harris?
Well, it's very interesting that Elizabeth Warren jumped to start talking up Kamala Harris. So there is clearly some definition coming into this race where national figures are suggesting she's going to be the progressive candidate. I don't like races getting locked up early. I like people considering running. And there are other folks in California who are talking about making the race. And I will just remind folks that California often throws us surprises. Barbara Boxer wasn't necessarily the presumed winner of her seat back in the 90s when she got it. In other races over the years, we've seen unexpected candidates come up. And so I hope that the Democratic primary in California will feature a serious competition with some people who really come from a lot of progressive positions. California is a critical state. It is a big state, and its senators do have real influence in Washington. Now, that said, I think it's exciting that Harris got in, and I think it's important that she be there because there was an awful lot of talk by some folks right after Barbara Boxer stepped back of, maybe looking toward a millionaire or billionaire candidate, someone very, very wealthy who could self-fund their campaign. We've got to watch out for that in our politics. It's not whether somebody's a progressive billionaire or progressive millionaire. We have to have a politics that is open to people who aren't super rich and aren't buying their way in.
Well, that's a good note to end on, John. I want to thank you so much for joining us as always.
Total pleasure, my dear. I really appreciate your show and everything you do. It's just terrific.
Thank you. John Nichols is a contributing writer for The Progressive and in these times, an associate editor of the Capital Times in Madison, Wisconsin. This is Uprising. When we come back, we will take a look at an issue that the media has all but forgotten, the Ebola crisis in West Africa. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. You can now watch Uprising online at our YouTube channel. That's at youtube.com/Uprising with Sonali. Please do subscribe. There was a time a few months ago when the biggest news on our radar was the Ebola epidemic, particularly when Ebola reached the U.S. Hysteria over the fatal contagion spread like wildfire. Since the epidemic started, it is estimated that thousands of people have died. In fact, new statistics by the World Health Organization released just this week put the exact death toll at 8,371 and the number of infected people at 21,171, and most of those in 3 West African countries, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea. But with the media coverage dying down, what has become of the spread of the virus? Well, there's good news and bad news. On the good news front, Sierra Leonean President Ernest Bai Koroma predicted yesterday that his nation will have no new Ebola cases by the end of March, and that it would be free of the virus by May. The U.S.'s Centers for Disease Control and Prevention Director, Dr. Tom Friedman, concurred on Tuesday, saying that the virus would likely not reemerge this year, and the World Health Organization has offered a similar, albeit cautious, prediction. The bad news is that earlier WHO predictions of eliminating the virus on January 1st did not pan out. In fact, in Guinea, one of the hard-hit nations, reports have emerged of a mob in a remote village killing 2 men suspected of having Ebola. And Sierra Leone reported 19 new cases this week alone. My guest is Dr. Duogbeh Chris Nyan. He is an infectious disease specialist and the director of the Secretariat of the Diaspora Liberian Emergency Response Task Force on the Ebola crisis. We've had him on the show before. Welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
Now, what do you make of the predictions by the WHO, the US CDC, and even the Sierra Leone president that we're confident of winning the war on Ebola this year? Are you also optimistic?
There is some hint of optimism because of the massive amount of support that have poured into the region. The prediction earlier by the CDC that cases could reach up to 1 million if the condition was not addressed has been debunked because the condition has been addressed. And many nations have poured in a lot of resources. There have been a lot of educational campaign and infectious disease awareness going on in the triplet countries, as I would call them, Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Liberia. And enough medical personnel have been sent. A lot of aid agencies have also donated a good number of materials and medicine as well as personnel to the region. Countries such as China, and Cuba, and the United States, of course, have sent in a huge amount of support in terms of manpower. So with all of this that we have called for in the past, we've seen a reduction in the cases. This is a situation of hope, but it is not the actual solution.
And of the 3 hardest hit countries, Liberia has been the worst, with more than 3,500 deaths out of the 8,300 recorded deaths. Why has Liberia fared so much worse than some of the other countries? And can Liberia declare victory against Ebola soon?
I am, again, optimistic that Liberia can declare a victory against Ebola, but that will come with a very big condition. Firstly, Liberia suffered 14 years of civil war, just as Sierra Leone, and now the infrastructure in that country was devastatingly destroyed. There was a high flight of medical personnel from the country, and so with the weak infrastructure, the country could not continue the outbreak. And also because of some irresponsible decisions that were made by the medical leadership in the country at the time, it also affected the progress to contain the virus. But again, the United States sent in a huge amount of manpower from the side of the military. And we continue to call on the United States, Britain, France, and other world powers and rich countries to pour in enough resources during my testimony at Congress in September last year. And we have seen this increase. But what remains to be seen is a proper mechanism that will be put in place in order to prevent an occurrence. As you will note, these countries also lack trained infectious disease experts that could be deployed in the event of an outbreak to contain the virus before even outside help comes in. So we will want for enough to be done in the direction of resuscitating the medical infrastructure in those countries, and that the aid and other finances that have been poured in should concentrate also on post-Ebola care, so that even people suffering from other infectious diseases such as malaria, who are dying from malaria other than Ebola, can also be cared for.
Now, I'm glad you bring up these broader issues. Poor medical infrastructure is part of the larger problem of poverty, which many saw as the sort of structural framework within which Ebola emerged. And of course, while the U.S. Aid is extremely important and played likely a very important role in helping to eradicate Ebola, some of that might have been driven by fears of Ebola reaching us here in the United States. But malaria and poverty in West Africa doesn't necessarily affect us directly and doesn't necessarily impact the U.S. Policies. I'm wondering if the broader issue of poverty, the broader structural issues of poverty are being addressed in the wake of this crisis. Of course, we can't quite pronounce the crisis over yet.
That is an issue of grave concern. There have always been this north-south disparity in terms of economic prosperity. The South has always been the area of exploitation, while the North get richer out of resources of the South. And this is a serious concern because it had not concentrated on building of very good infrastructure in those countries. Poverty is widespread. You have areas, communities that have conglomeration of people with no medical or little medical care. Take the borough of West Point, for example, in Liberia, which is highly populated, densely populated, but it has no good sanitary equipment. It has no good hospitals. There is a Catholic clinic in that community which serves a population of over 10,000 or so. And so it is a situation that really needs to be addressed, that people have to be put back to work. The society needs to invest its resources in the direction of alleviating poverty. But the West, particularly the rich countries, will have to play a major role, since in fact these southern countries are rich with resources, and during the question of exploitation of those resources, there should be conditions put in place for infrastructural development and policies that will lead towards reduction of poverty and lead to education.
Finally, one of the issues that has come up in terms of trying to pinpoint why the Ebola crisis spread so fast is the palm oil industry in Guinea and some other West African countries. This has been a theory, and there's even been a scientific paper examining the role of palm oil plantations. And because of the deforestation that it has going along with it, but also because of the attraction of fruit bats to palm oil plantations, and fruit bats apparently are crucial in spreading the disease. What do you make of this theory? There's been a huge demand for palm oil from the West, from Western countries.
Certainly, we've seen this huge demand, but from time immemorial, the West African countries, which are tropical in nature, have dependent on this high production and consumption of palm oil. Then and now, there is not a clear-cut study that has shown that the concentration of fruit bats in attacking this palm oil or because of the deforestation has increased or not. Secondly, it is scientifically established that the fruit bats spread the disease, but there needs to be enough studies done so as to establish the pattern of disease transmission. There needs to be enough studies done so as to establish that pattern, linking it to the palm oil industry that you just mentioned. And in the absence of that, it is difficult to really only pinpoint the palm oil industry as being, one of the large cause of the transfer of the disease.
Right. So certainly more research needed on that. I want to thank you again for joining us once more to discuss this issue, and may we pronounce the Ebola virus eradicated this year. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Dr. Duogbeh Chris Nyan is my guest. He is an infectious disease specialist and the director of the Secretariat of the Diaspora Liberian Emergency Response Task Force on the Ebola crisis. This is Uprising. When we come back, we'll speak with the author of the book Digital Rebellion, Todd Wolfson. He tries to chronicle what he calls the birth of the cyber left. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. The rise of the internet has been a game changer for political activism. With the ability to instantly communicate with one another, set up meetings, share lots of information quickly, publish images and videos, and focus public attention on important issues, political organizing has become more efficient and more creative. Millions of people all over the world now rely on online social networks to remain connected with like-minded people and sometimes launch revolutions, as in Egypt or Hong Kong. Although the origins of this form of social and political organizing seem like ancient history, only a decade or two has passed since the early days of internet-based activism. During those short years, we have seen the rise and fall and evolution of movements like the anti-globalization, anti-Iraq war, and Occupy Wall Street protests. What can we learn from these earlier movements for social change and how they organized and developed means of communication? My guest, Todd Wolfson's new book, chronicles what he calls the cyber left. Digital Rebellion, the birth of the cyber left, is an examination of, quote, the tactics and strategy of resistance in the years 1994 to 2006, with a particular focus on the independent media network, or indie media. Todd Wolfson now joins me. Welcome to the show.
Thanks very much for having me.
Well, how do you define the cyber left? That's a pretty broad term, and also give our audience a short history on the independent media network.
Sure. Maybe I'll start with indie media. Indie media, the Independent Media Network, developed in 1999 during the World Trade Organization protests. The organizers, that was one of the biggest uprisings in the U.S. that we've seen. I'm sure your listeners are aware. And the organizers, when they were planning it, believed that they had to use the internet to create their own news outlet because they couldn't trust Fox News or CNN. And so they took advantage of the newly developing internet and they created the Seattle Independent Media Center. And the goal was to connect activists, organizers, independent journalists with a media platform so that they could tell and share their stories. And they had FM radio station, they had a daily newspaper, they made video news releases each day, and they also created an open publishing website, which was, I think, the first of its kind, the first website where people could go on, tell their story, and instantaneously see their story up on the site. It prefigures the things we're so accustomed to today, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or even blogging in general. So indie media after Seattle, there was a whole lot of excitement, particularly within the anti-globalization or global social justice movement. And as protests emerged in different cities, whether it was protests against the Democratic National Convention in LA or the Republican National Convention in Philly or the World Bank meetings, when the protest would develop, there would also be an independent media center that developed. And many of these centers stayed around. And say by 2002, 2003, there are 100 of them on 6 continents, creating news in over 30 languages, and they were networked together. Some of them really depended on the internet, but many of them had newspapers or radio stations, which I believe in LA, there was a very strong radio component to the indie media. So it became this vibrant network that told the story from a left perspective of communities in struggle and of the global social justice movement.
I have to say it was so interesting reading your book because this was something that I was personally involved in, having attended some of the earliest meetings in Los Angeles on the Independent Media Network, involved also in the website for the Democratic National Convention coming to Los Angeles. So this is a story that I know some of our younger audience may not know, and some of our audience who may have become politically active later may not know. But the Indie Media Network and many of the members of the cyber left, as you called them in the 90s, were deeply influenced by the Zapatista movement. And from that, they, as your book chronicles, adopted the sort of organizational structures, horizontal decision-making. Can you tell us about the level of influence, in particular the Freeing the Media address by Subcomandante Marcos, given by video to a teach-in in the 90s that is since quite famous?
Yeah, I mean, there are many origin points to indie media, and two, I would say that cyber left writ large. But the strongest, the thickest root, the thing that has the most, I would say, ideological kind of intersection and influence is definitely the Zapatistas. And so the Zapatistas had their own kind of uprising in 1994, the day the North American Free Trade Agreement went into effect. So there's this parallelism between the WTO, which was the NAFTA on steroids, right? It was a global free trade versus the northern, our hemisphere. And so they had an uprising on the day the North American Free Trade Agreement went into effect. And in their struggle with the Mexican state, they used the internet and other media too. They put out communiques, they used newspapers, they were using radio, but they were very strategic in using the internet. And in a moment of struggle with the Mexican state where they were overmatched, they were able to use the internet to make a call, or at least their supporters were able to use the internet to make a call that stayed the hand of the Mexican army and enabled a peace accord, which the Mexican state eventually rescinded on parts of it. But they got some autonomy over land, etc. But what's very interesting about this is building on a sort of a real identification as an important movement. The Zapatistas then made a call for two things. One, a network of struggle against neoliberal capitalism, and two, a network of communications that links different points of struggle together. And then Subcomandante Marcos made an address, as you marked, at a Freeing the Media conference that took place in New York City in '97. And many of the founders of Indie Media were at that conference. And so Subcomandante Marcos made that call. Again, we need this global communications network. Folks who founded Indie Media were there, heard that call, and put it into practice in Seattle 2 years later. So there's a direct intersection, and many of the founders could always point to the Zapatistas as both a place where they got ideological direction and nourishment, but then also practical skills and or at least a practical vision of how to use the internet.
Todd, how well did some of the organizational and structures of decision-making and some of the tactics that a group like Indie Media took from, and other groups in the cyber left, that they took from the Zapatistas, how well did that translate into U.S. social movements? Because, of course, Indie Media is still active in some countries, but it doesn't have nearly the level of influence that it did in the 90s, late 90s, and through the early 2000s.
Absolutely. I think that there are some problems in trying to translate the practice of land-based, geographically rooted struggle in southern Mexico and translating it either into a U.S. context or into the context of a global movement. And so the Zapatistas were very democratic. They were rooted in communities, right? And so there was democratic decision-making processes that have a long history in what was largely a Mayan culture. That got translated as a deep democratic processes and practices in indie media, which is a global network where people are trying to make decisions across time zone and across language. And so I think there are real struggles throughout the history of indie media and real problems making democratic decisions. I think what we saw in indie media was that it worked well when there were external crises or external situations. Indie media activists are able to swoop in and coordinate and act in convergence from multiple points. We could call it swarming. But there was very little ability to collectively create a shared program. And I think that's because of an attempt to directly translate Zapatista practice into different circumstances. So I think there's real problems, and we could think about it around democratic practice. We could also think about it around, flat network structures without any hierarchy or accountability. We could also think about it in this sort of vision of multiple struggles with no struggle at the lead. All of these things which were part of the Zapatista call and were interpreted by indie media and other movements were important interpretations, but might not have translated perfectly.
Now, in your book, you write, quote, "I began to see techno-utopian tendencies that favor the leadership of white male college-educated activists at the expense of building a movement that connected to those most oppressed." Was this the Achilles heel of the cyber left?
For me, I think from my vantage, absolutely, it is the Achilles heel. So in all the cyber left movements, you see people talk about class and capitalism, but it feels often like people are opposed to these things, but they're not using an analysis of class and capitalism that helps them build strategy about what is to be done. So I think that analysis would lead people to say, we need to embed indie media centers in the local communities we're working with, create programs of training folks in those communities so that they can take ownership over those websites. But that sort of analysis never happened. And so what you got were, I think, really important technological tools. I mean, again, the indie media open publishing, I think, prefigures all the things we take for granted today, whether it's Facebook and Twitter or community journalism and blogging, but they weren't able to connect in deep ways to local communities. And I believe that was because those who had the most power in the indie media movement, because it was lack of transparent power structures, it was very invisible forms of power, because folks who are white, middle-class, college-educated had the most power, they tended to track the movement towards technology over local struggle.
Right, and so also this then follows into the question of whether process often trumped action, whether the adherence to not having a clear agenda, leaderlessness, ended up being the result why even later formations of the cyber left, such as the Occupy Wall Street movement, might not have lasted.
Absolutely. From my vantage, that's absolutely the case. I mean, again, who can really argue with trying to have democracy in movements? It's a critical question, but there needs to be some question of what sorts of democracy make the most sense, and whether we actually want to build leaders. I mean, I like the language of leaderlessness, but I think if we're really trying to build the leadership of the poor, for instance, that you need to really create programs that put them in leadership, that get people prepared to take leadership and accountability structures. So I think what you saw in indie media and certainly in Occupy is that the non-centralized leaderlessness and kind of direct democratic processes lead to quick development, really quick moving movements, whether it's indie media or Occupy, that develop really fast because there is no center, anyone can take it on, and that's excellent, the growth. But I think it also leads to the sort of quick quick ending of these movements. They don't know how to build infrastructure, etc.
Finally, what do you make of the newest U.S.-wide movement that has emerged just in the past year, led by and comprised primarily by people of color in communities that have seen not just widespread poverty, but police violence? I'm, of course, talking about the Black Lives Matter campaigns that were sparked in Ferguson, led primarily by African Americans and many women especially, also relying heavily on online communications and some of the tools that now the very centralized corporate networks offer, such as Facebook and Twitter, but maybe making as good use of them as possible. What do you make of those, and are those a more sort of authentic expression of the cyber left that you are heartened by?
I'm definitely heartened by them. I think it's a great development. I mean, obviously the precursor to these developments is heartbreaking, but what we've seen in the Black Lives Matter movement is people taking leadership from the struggle on the ground. So people of color, women, African Americans, using the internet to accelerate that struggle, but keeping the movement, one, building institutions. So there's a lot of institutional development we see in this stage, but two, keeping the movement grounded in and led by those most oppressed by racism, police brutality, etc. So I think it's a great development, and in many ways they're picking up and taking what is most exciting about the cyber left and marrying it to logic and local struggle that gives it great possibility.
And then finally, Todd, is there a contradiction in what I mentioned, which is that these struggles are increasingly left to rely on the Facebooks and the Twitters that, of course, can quite dangerously cut off the ties that we build?
Yeah, there's definitely a danger to this, and it's one of the, I think, tensions that indie media brought to the fore. They were very careful about keeping and maintaining their own servers, and there's a history there of FBI raids and states going after indie media servers. And they did that because they wanted independence from corporate platforms. And that leads to a hard road in what they built. I think contemporary movements, or Black Lives Matter, for instance, but also the Arab uprisings, and I think Occupy as well, have utilized corporate platforms, Facebook, Twitter, and it's been to their advantage thus far. But in the long term, one has to question whether there are going to be some concerns, issues, or problems that emerge if we don't figure out independent platforms that do some of this work.
Well, you can write another book about that, and we'll have you back on the show. Thank you so much, Todd Wolfson, for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Todd Wolfson is the author of Digital Rebellion, The Birth of the Cyber Left. This is Uprising. Bipasha Shom is our senior producer. Anna Buss is our assistant producer. Dan Swerdlove is our technical director. Christian Beck is our production assistant. Teddy Robinson and Jonathan Alexander are our audio engineers. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Uprising with Sonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you tomorrow.